Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Chapter 1118 leaves us with a pretty controversial ending from what I've seen on the internet, but I'm here to explain as much as I can and hopefully try and ease some people's potential frustrations. So in this breakdown, I'll be getting into what exactly Bonney's powers are able to do, the significance of some new confirmation on how Vegapunk and the satellites work, why the world hates the Straw Hats, and much more. As always, if you end up enjoying this video, be sure to like and subscribe so you can get my weekly manga breakdowns as soon as they come out. Now with that said, let's get into chapter 1118, The Most Free. The chapter starts off with the 8th entry in the Ogre Child Yamato's Golden Harvest Surrogate Pilgrimage cover story, as we find Yamato finally leaving the flower capital with a huge crowd sending them off. Throughout this cover story, it's been nice seeing just how much the people of Wano actually love Yamato for helping save the country despite being the child of Kaido. In hand, of course, is the bento lunch that Hiyori and Otoko had prepared, which evidently Yamato has already dug into at the very beginning of their journey. Now, there's not too much else to say about this entry in the cover story, though you may recall that the first stop on Yamato's journey was to be Kibi, a region located behind the flower capital. Here, we find Yamato's leaving from the front of the capital and going straight forward instead of around the perimeter to the backside where Kibi would be. This may suggest to me that Yamato may actually be heading toward Ebisu town on the outskirts of the flower capital, the place that Yasue called home during the last period of his life. Now, I had been wondering if Yamato would visit Ebisu during my chapter 1114 breakdown when we first saw the map of their journey, and had speculated that we may end up there last after resting Yasue's sword in Ringo, but it seems we may start off the journey there instead. And speaking of Yasue's sword, you may have realized that Yamato does not seem to be carrying it here, nor have we seen it with Yamato since it was depicted in that 4th volume of the cover story. It seems a bit too unwieldy to fit in Yamato's backpack, and we definitely have not seen it on their hip or back either. Perhaps this is not a huge deal and we'll just see them pull it out of somewhere when the time comes, but it does make me wonder if this is another plot point in the story. Maybe Yamato has forgotten about the blade altogether, and now another character is tasked with catching up to them and delivering it to them. I could definitely see Momonosuke's dragon form covering enough ground to do so, but we'll just have to see. Now on to the chapter itself. We pick back up right where we left off, with the Iron Giant crashing into the ocean, displacing many of the surrounding marine ships. And we also get a glimpse at the real transmission transponder snail inside the Iron Giant, getting knocked out and tossed around. Like we had discussed before, it's the same snail that York described with the conical shell that we also saw in Film Red. And as speculated in the previous breakdown, it seems that the broadcast was not completely cut off, with us getting a tiny bit more about some name before resuming radio silence. Again, there's not too much to go off on here, though there may be more reason now to speculate that the certain thing within the D's that Vegapunk was talking about is actually in reference to a specific person. If you're interested on more of what Vegapunk's message could have been about before it was cut off, be sure to revisit my chapter 1117 breakdown from last week. Now, as the Iron Giant sinks into the ocean alongside several marine ships, it wonders where Joy Boy went and expresses this desire to meet him, answering one of our questions from the previous chapters by suggesting that it indeed was moving towards Luffy, who himself was running toward the northeast coast of the island. We can then figure out its relative location at this point thanks to some of the information from the previous chapters. At the end of Wano, we got the relative locations of Winter Island, Elbaf, and Egghead, placing Elbaf to the northeast of Egghead, which was later reassured to us by Vegapunk. In the previous chapter, we saw the elders approach the giant from its side when attacking, so since the Iron Giant was moving toward the northeast coast of the island, if we assume Workery's charge sent it flying in a relatively straight direction, then we may be able to deduce that it was sent off somewhere between the north and northwest coasts of the island. The ships surrounding the island are also now seeing Workery for the first time, since all of the Marines were told to leave the island and return to their ships for the Buster Call. Though, with all of the insanity going on, none of them are able to recognize this as being one of the 5 elders. We briefly go around the world, then get some reactions to the message being cut off. And we start with this place that seems to feature a lot of patterns, perhaps inspired by indigenous cultures of our world. The visual transponder snail here doesn't seem to clue us into any more details, since the only major feature is the mustache, which I've talked about before as being a fairly common trait shared among the large visual transponder snails in the series. Though, you may recognize the next place as being Yuba, with Koza, Toto, and Kappa at the forefront, along with Eric over to the side. We actually just saw these characters a few chapters ago, when I talked about how Eric's hair had been reverted to being a lighter color, matching his appearance pre-time skip, but it seems this may have been a mistake on Oda's part, as it's now inked in, corresponding to his post-time skip appearance that we saw on the Decks of the World cover story. The people of the world are wondering who it could have been that ended the message and killed Vegapunk. They seem to discount the possibility that it was the world government who did him in, and instead look toward the Straw Hat Pirates, citing the newspaper headline from earlier in the day where Morgans reported that the Straw Hats had taken Vegapunk hostage. Now, you may be wondering why the people of the Alabasta Kingdom would be so hostile to Luffy and his crew, but recall that their involvement in saving the kingdom from Baroque works was never relayed to the public. The whole incident was covered up, and in the books, it was the work of Smoker and his marines that took down Crocodile. Not only that, it was also reported weeks ago that it was Sabo who killed King Cobra, and with the world aware of him being Luffy's brother from the previous newspapers of the world, the people of the Alabasta Kingdom would already be antagonistic toward the Straw Hats. Over at Whiskey Peak, we find similar sentiments in the town of bounty hunters as we get the return of Mr. 11, Miss Monday, and their child. We last saw this couple during the Decks of the World cover story, reading about the return of the Straw Hat Pirates. This chef at the front is a bit hard to place, and he seems to be another fellow bounty hunter, given what appears to be a rifle strapped to his back. We had seen plenty of bounty hunters who were cooks during the Whiskey Peak arc, but none of them matched this specific design. Either way, it seems he may be the one speaking on how it doesn't seem plausible for the world government to assassinate the world's greatest mind, something we've seen echoed by others throughout this arc. It's the absurdity of this truth alongside the government-driven propaganda that's really making it hard for the people of the world to learn the reality behind the Egghead incident. Not only that, Vegapunk has also been stressing how he himself doesn't know who is truly good or bad, and how his assassin may not be entirely evil either. And so, it's left for the people of the world to piece together who they believe the enemy is here. Vegapunk's goal was not to just tell people who's right or wrong, especially since Joy Boy and by extension the Ancient Kingdom was also guilty of promoting these world-destroying ancient weapons. It's possible some people heed Vegapunk's words here and reserve judgment on the Straw Hat Pirates, but for most people who have never directly encountered the crew or learned of their heroism, it's difficult for them to see them as more than just pirates. Also off in the corner is what looks to be a nun, which could actually be Miss Katharina, another bounty hunter we met during the Whiskey Peak arc. We also get a fun scene of one of Luffy's own Grand Fleet captains, Leo, falling for the world government's propaganda, with the Tontada having been established as being incredibly gullible. Beside him is of course Rebecca, and we last saw these two at the start of Vegapunk's broadcast several chapters ago. We then cut back to Egghead, where York is being questioned about the status of the other Vegapunks. Notice the hole in Punk records that was the result of Mars bursting out of it in his Itsumari form after having been tricked by the decoy snail. York explains that she was able to check which satellites were accessing Punk records, which raises a bunch of questions for me. Up until this point, we were under the assumption that the satellites only synced with Punk records once a day, but here, it seems they are still connected to Punk records even when not syncing, which would make sense if it weren't for the fact that none of the Vegapunks seemed aware that York was not in sync. So perhaps now, we have a new understanding of how Punk Records works, which ultimately would reconcile the lingering question of how the rest of the Vegapunks were unaware of York not syncing for the last 3 or so months that she's been in contact with the world government. It seems all the Vegapunks are continuously connected to Punk Records, and this can be observed, but the syncing of information is a manual process that they each do once a day, and this process was not being monitored by the rest of the Vegapunks since they had no reason to assume one of them would not be doing this. And with York's purpose being the handling of physical needs, it would follow that she was not expected to assist with any of the research that the rest of the Vegapunks were participating in, allowing her to go about her days without intaking any of the new information provided by the other Vegapunks. The notion that all of the Vegapunks are connected via Punk records outside of the daily syncing also explains how the physical needs of the other satellites are met by York's activities without her needing to sync her brain explicitly. York also explains that Atlas and Lilith are still active, suggesting that Edison has either passed away by this point or at the very least is damaged enough to where he is no longer connected to Punk Records. And if you recall, we last saw him just 2 chapters ago when speaking to Stussy, where he was propped up against a machine in the part of the Labo phase that controls the cloud-making building. Lilith was last seen in the previous chapter besides the Straw Hats on the Sunny, and of course, we see Atlas on the giant ship in this chapter as well. Coincidentally, the first 2 satellites that we were formally introduced to are the last 2 that are left alive here, not counting Shaka, of course, who we were technically introduced to soon after Lilith, though we didn't get his full reveal until after Atlas's. This of course prompts the Elders to continue pursuing the 2 remaining satellites as they resume their plan to kill all of the Vegapunks, with the business of the broadcast being handled. This is the last of their lingering goals, as they've effectively secured the safety of York and have located Punk Records and the power plant, which produces Mother Flame. Speaking of Punk Records, we got confirmation that it is not necessarily dependent on Vegapunk and continues to operate even after his death, though it should be noted that it's certainly possible for any of these goals to fall through the cracks should there be something like an explosion or massive damage to the Labo phase. We'll just have to see. The elders split up in two directions, and it's not necessarily clear where everyone is headed, though since Mars does end up on the northeast coast of the island, then perhaps that's where Saturn and Jupiter are headed as well. Mercury heading in the opposite direction could mean he's going to scale the island cloud from the center of the Fabrio phase to assist Nusturo up top. Speaking of, we do see him briefly in this chapter, and it seems he's now in front of the Sunny, as opposed to the last chapter where he was approaching it from behind. Over on the northeast coast, Luffy, Dory, and Brogy finally make it to the ship, and I love that Luffy immediately asks about Usopp and Chopper, as he knows that the two of them would appreciate being on such a giant ship the most. It seems that in the meantime, Bonney has dealt with Vice Admiral Dahl and Bluegrass, who were attacking the giants in their ship in the previous chapter by turning them into children. Not only that, the mecha sea beast that was under Bluegrass's control seems to have aged down as well. This technique has yet to be formally named ever since it debuted during the Sabaody Archipelago arc, but we've seen it used numerous times throughout the series. Most recently, she turned Vice Admiral Pomsky into a child as well by simply placing a hand on him. Earlier in this arc, she turned a Vegapunk into a kid by pushing out his ears, represented by various jewels, with a pipe, and there she called this variation of the technique Age Skewer. Interestingly, in this scene, we see her with a pistol in hand, taunting the two Vice Admirals, suggesting that she may have used it to alter their ages in this instance. We actually saw her use her powers via bullets earlier in this arc with her near-death experience technique, which seemingly afflicted her targets with a shock of dying. Bonney has quite an interesting and vast set of abilities, and we'll be talking more about this in just a bit. Luffy reunites with Oimo and Kashi, the latter of whom seems to be back on board the ship and wounded after having taken a beating by Dahl in the last chapter, resulting in him falling overboard. He then makes his way to the kitchen, where we are introduced to the cook of the giant warrior pirates. Though unnamed, he does have a unique laugh here that is somewhat similar to Dory's laugh. He mentions how the captains told him to prepare a lot of food, knowing that Luffy had a huge appetite, and we saw Dory learn this about Luffy firsthand when they shared a meal during the Little Garden arc. This is of course another convenient means of allowing Luffy to recharge his stamina for Gear 5th, and while this has been a recurring plot device which allowed Luffy to continue fighting, it feels like it's been used quite a lot in rapid succession in this part of the arc, as this is the 4th time he's used Gear 5th in one day. At the start of the day, we returned to Egghead and found Luffy scarfing down a ton of food along with Bonney and the others. With the energy from this, he used Gear 5th against Kizaru before running out of steam. Then, he acquired some more food, presumably from the automatic cooking machine that he ended up in front of, which he used to energize himself against Kizaru, Saturn, and eventually even the rest of the 5 elders, until he once again reverted out of the form when running away with the giants. Dory and Brogy supplied him with some emergency food that allowed him to regain his energy and eventually use Gear 5th once more against Mercury, but this was ineffective as well, and he seemingly reverted back sometime between his appearance in the last chapter. And now, he gets another large supply of nourishment, allowing him to use Gear 5th once more. When you put it into perspective, he's gone in and out of Gear 5th 4 times in the span of roughly 30 chapters, and time-wise, this is likely happening in less than half a day's worth of time. This also isn't including his use of Gear 5th against Lucci in the previous day, and who knows if he used it against the Seraphim overnight, so in around 24 hours, Luffy has used Gear 5th at least 5 times. I guess my point with all of this is not to necessarily complain about all of the plot conveniences that have allowed for Luffy to regain stamina in a short span of chapters, but rather to draw attention to Luffy's inability to keep up this form without them. We saw this with the other gears as well, of course, but it feels like there's a lot of hopefully intentional focus being put on the strawback for Luffy, and I'm somewhat expecting for it to be addressed explicitly in some form. Outside, Mars approaches the ship and lets out what looks to be a blast of fire. We saw him use a similar technique earlier in the arc, but that featured spiraling electricity around it. Whatever this is blocked by 3 of the giants, 2 of whom seem to be named Bjorn and Sig. Bjorn is a Scandinavian word that can mean bear, and from what I understand, Sig seems to have a few different meanings in different contexts as well. Though they defended against it, Mars's attack seems to have been strong enough to set them and part of the ship on fire. Now Dory and Brogy also point out that it's going to be difficult to escape the elders if one of them can fly, which narratively suggests to me that Mars is going to have to be dealt with somehow in this arc. Simply sailing away will not be enough. Now while all of this is going on, the waves suddenly start roiling as the surrounding marine ships bounce off of the ocean. At first they consider this another earthquake, but then they realize the drums of liberation swelling around the scene. While this could just be the result of something like the effect of the Iron Giant sinking in the ocean on the other side of the island, it stands to reason that the bouncing waves may be from Luffy entering Gear 5th. This scene bears a lot of resemblance to Luffy's usage of Gear 5th earlier in this arc when he made the ground of the island shake and bounce just like this, effectively making it rubber such that the fallen group could land safely. Perhaps our speculation from the last chapter of Luffy giving his rubber-like properties to the ocean or the giant ship to allow the Sunny to land safely may come true here. After all, this point was once again stressed by Nami in this chapter. Now the final part of this chapter has been a bit controversial from what I've seen. Whenever there's this kind of outcry from a vocal part of the fandom, it's usually unwarranted and reactionary at best. past. For example, there were a lot of similar complaints when Gear 5th was first introduced or when time travel became a thing in the series, as many fans jumped the gun and just assumed the worst. That said, whenever Oda introduces a concept that could be story breaking, he almost always establishes limits and rules to prevent anything too crazy. For example, we immediately learned in the subsequent chapter that time travel could only work forwards and not backwards, and similarly, while a lot of fans thought that Gear 5th was full on Toon Force, we've seen that it's a lot more limited than that over the course of the past 70 or so chapters since its introduction. So with that, I completely expect there to be some limitations to whatever ends up coming next with Bonney's abilities. People like to make outlandish assertions assuming that she can just dream up alternate realities where she has any power she wants, and there's really just no coherent reason to believe that's the case at this point. So let's get into what Bonney's powers can actually do. At its most basic usage, Bonney's Age fruit allows her to age herself or others up or down. However, she can also use it to age people into alternate selves, using a technique known as Distorted Future. We actually first saw this toward the start of the arc when she turned Luffy into a 70-year-old version of himself from a different future. In fact, we saw a similar depiction of an older Luffy in a bad timeline of events as drawn by Oda in Volume 89's SBS. This technique was also formally named a bit later when she used it on herself to become bigger and more muscular, sort of resembling the physicality of a buccaneer like her father Kuma, as if this were a future where she was actually his blood-related daughter. Later on during the flashback, we saw that Bonney had used this technique years ago to grant herself a Nika-like future after being inspired by the description of Nika as told to her by her father. She also used this in the present day against Saturn, and we'll talk more about this instance in just a second. More recently, a few chapters ago, she used the technique to grant her a giant-like future, allowing her the physicality of giants that were helping her. Now, back when she used the technique against Saturn, her Nika-like future form slowly faded and reverted back to herself, as Saturn reasoned that while she knows of the name, she doesn't have a full understanding of Nika. He continues to explain that the fruit is predicated on the presence of belief. Her ability to grant an alternate future revolves around her faith in that future as being possible. As Saturn explains, the more she comes to terms with reality, the weaker her faith in a possible future becomes, and in that instance against Saturn, she started losing hope for a reality where Nika would come to save her and her father, and as a result, her Nika-like future diminished. And to capitalize on this wavering, Saturn continued to discourage the existence of Nika in front of her. Of course, not too long after that, Nika would appear before her as Luffy returned to the battle, and it became clear to Bonney that between the rhythm that she heard and Vegapunk's confirmation, Luffy was the Nika that she had been looking for. This ultimately restored her belief in Nika, which in turn restored her Nika-like future as a possibility once again. Not only that, Luffy effectively teaches her how to improve her technique when in that form and shows her how to really throw a punch. All of this comes to a climax in this chapter as Luffy in Gear 5th invites Bonney to join him in taking down Mars. At this point, she's made the connection between Nika and Luffy and has a more complete understanding of what Nika looks like, as Kuma was not aware of his true appearance when he told Bonney about him. She thinks back to what Luffy said at the start of the arc when she asked what was going on with his all-white appearance on his bounty poster, and realizes the future she's looking for is not necessarily the one where she is Nika-like, but the one where she is most free. The giants on the ship cheer and dance at the appearance of what they think are two Nikas, which, by the way, makes this the first instance of any Elbaf giants uttering the name of Nika, as so far we've only seen them refer to it as the Sun God. Now, up to this point, Bonney's distorted future has only allowed Bonney the physicality of the futures that she ages into. The buccaneer-like body, the giant body, the rubber-like body of Nika that she believed was true. And this may still be the case here, as she's taken on the appearance of Nika and the physical attributes, such as the heartbeat, but we've yet to see her do anything out of the ordinary like apply the properties of rubber to others. Also of note, her outer appearance seems to be a mix of her appearance pre-time skip with thigh-high socks, shorts and tank top, and suspenders, but also including Luffy's waistband sash in this form. Like I said at the start of the section, I don't think this can nor should be taken as confirmation that she can imagine herself having any and all powers in the future. It took years of believing in Nika and finally coming to learn the truth behind him to actualize this possible future. That said, I'm not going to promise anything. It's Oda's story, and he could have a pretty serious twist here if he'd like. Either way, I'm sure there will be some limitations like I said. After all, she could only maintain her giant-like future briefly, as seen when she reverted back to her normal age not too long after using it. And with this being a much more distorted future, I sort of expect this to be a brief transformation as well. To me, this feels like a big narrative moment for Bonney and Kuma, more than it is some testament to a character's power levels or whatever nonsense people like to undermine this moment with. Kuma had placed his hopes for the future in both his daughter and Luffy, and now both of them stand before him, embodying the essence of his personal hero, Nika. This is a full circle moment for what the idea of Nika means for the people who believe in it, not necessarily some definitive usurpation of the story's magic system. From my perspective, Bonney is not emulating a future where she ate the gum gum fruit, but rather a future where she is Nika. The distinction there being that she believes in Nika as an actual person or figure, even if they do not exist. This is not that far of a stretch from the notion of believing in a future where she is a giant, for example, and maybe that's people's core issues with it. They are perhaps approaching it from the perspective of Bonney imagining herself with powers, rather than her imagining a future where she is a specific person. It's unclear if Kuma is actually taking this in or not due to his vegetative state, but we do see a flashback to the scene from earlier in the arc where we saw him in the church after Jinny's death. Now, as Bonney and Luffy start to fight back, we see what looks to be Warcury and Jupiter headed for something they find troublesome. This is interesting, as I thought Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter were all headed toward one direction, but I suppose it could be the case that Jupiter was with Warcury in this panel, since it's hard to say which way he was facing for sure. Also, at first I assumed this pair was heading toward the northeastern shore and sensing the presence of a quote-unquote second Nika, but since Mars and Warcury seemingly went in separate directions, it would suggest to me that Warcury and Jupiter may be reacting to something else. The silhouette beyond them is obscured and rough to make out. The final panels of the Iron Giant having seemingly found who it was that it was looking for is also interesting. With two figures that play with the drums of liberation booming, I would expect the Iron Giant to be able to get back up with ease now, since that was what seemingly energized it in the previous chapters. This was also what had suggested to me that Warcury and Jupiter were heading toward the northeastern coast, but now I'm not exactly sure either. It's unclear if both the Iron Giant and this pair of elders are reacting to the same exact thing or not. If it's the latter case and the elders are headed toward another part of the island, I wonder what we have left. The Blackbeard pirates and Caribou were still on the island earlier, but were on their way out. Whatever it is, it would have to be something with great enough significance for the pair to be this concerned. Perhaps we're just overthinking things here, and the safest bet is that they are all just reacting to the presence of two Nikas. Either way, this was a pretty crazy chapter with such a cathartic twist at the end, and I'd love to know what you all thought about it in the comments. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Or are you just hoping to get more information in the coming chapters? If you enjoyed this breakdown, be sure to like and subscribe so you can get more videos like this one every week. And thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.